What's good, fam? Teacher Eddie here on another live stream. We're doing another tier list. Yes, I love these tier lists. I've done 2 of these so far. And today we're doing, based on the votes, based on the Discord, I'm going to be ranking all of the presidents. Not including, of course, Joe Biden, because he's the sitting current president. So, yeah. That wouldn't really be fair. So the way this tier list is going to be broken down is at the very top, we got our Mount Rushmore presidents. So these are presidents that have not just been great presidents, not have been just amazing presidents, but presidents who really changed the course of history of this country and the world. Then we have our legendary presidents, presidents who may not be, at that Mount Rushmore level, but they were really influential and they did amazing things for this country. Then we have our great presidents, maybe presidents who did a great job in office, maybe didn't fulfill, maybe they were one-term presidents, whatever it may be. Then we have our good presidents. They didn't do anything super great, but they also didn't do anything super bad. Then we got our bad presidents who were just bad. Then we got our presidents that are the worst of the worst of the worst. I named it the Hail Satan category. And then down here we have not applicable, which are basically presidents who are incomplete, so to speak. So, presidents who didn't, fulfill their full first term, died in office, or just didn't really do anything. So we're going to be going in order from first to Donald Trump. When this list was made, Donald was still president. But again, we're not judging Joe Biden. And also just want to make it clear that I'm not judging these presidents on any personal feelings, because there are some presidents who I don't really like personally, but I think were good presidents or maybe even great presidents. And there are some presidents that I do like that may just be good, but maybe even bad. So again, I'm not making this about politics. This is not about left-wing, right-wing, conservatives, all that, all those stupid labels. I don't believe in those labels. So I'm just going to be judging them based on their merits, based on their presidency. And with each president, of course, I'll be giving a little bit of information on why I'm making that decision. I'm going to point out their good points, their bad points, maybe throw in a fun fact here and there. Obviously, I'm not going to go in depth with every single president, because then this is going to be like a 10-hour podcast or live stream. I'm sorry. I'm used to, because I'm doing this on Twitch and YouTube, I'm used to calling it the podcast. But anyway, just quickly before that, just want to shout out some of the people in the chat with us tonight. We got Demon Queen, DBRP Variety, Marcus Hellier, still waiting for ERB Master Chief versus Leonidas. Man, everybody's waiting for some ERB. What's up, Eddie? Everything's good, fam. I appreciate it. Someone's a little full of himself in the chat. Who's that? Who full of himself? Who do you think is the best president? Well, that's a question we're going to answer today. Gamers Unite, what's up? And Freeze Wag Duck, Jalen Raybon. Thank you guys for joining tonight. Really appreciate it. And really, of course, appreciate the support. Obviously, any donations also greatly appreciated. So let's get started. So the first is obviously the easiest one, George Washington, father of our country, the man who led us through the Revolutionary War. And in all honesty, out of all the presidents, aside maybe from Lincoln, I would say just perfect man, at the perfect time, and just the man who made the times, not the times that made the man, which is a huge difference. So with George Washington, I mean, there's a reason that he is called the father of our country. Not only was he the first president, but he was the man who set the precedent for all future presidents. Most famously, of course, was stepping down after 2 terms, because that was never written anywhere in the Constitution, that the president can only serve 2 terms. In fact, they wanted Washington to serve a 3rd term. Then if he served a 3rd term, they probably would have wanted him to serve a 4th term. But Washington was the one who set the precedent that there should be a two-term maximum. And that was the case, except for one president, which was, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served 4 terms as president. No other president had served 4 or 3 terms, except for Roosevelt. Also insisting to be called Mr. President. People wanted, especially Hamilton, to refer to Washington as His Excellency or His Highness. But Washington was very cognizant that he was the first man, that he was the one that everyone would follow. So a lot of the things that we take for granted nowadays as presidential were in fact set by Washington. Now, as far as some of Washington's failures, he failed to prepare the country and the presidency for the factions that would follow, which led to chaos in the second presidential election. Election for the second president, because Washington did serve 2 terms. Meaning, Washington's farewell address when he left office, if you've never read it, I highly suggest you do. It is one of the best farewell addresses from any president, maybe aside from Eisenhower's, warning the country of what his biggest fears were. And one of his biggest fears were political parties and factions, as he called them. And what happens in the second election between Adams and Jefferson? We get factions, which led to absolute chaos. And I think that was Washington's biggest failing as president. But of course, Washington established all the precedents. Washington carried this country through chaotic times. Because when we speak of the founding fathers, a lot of times people speak of them as this kind of band of brothers, you know, that just all got together and magically said, hey, let's create a country here. And they mapped everything out and everyone went to bed happy and everything else. Instead, in reality, they were a bunch of petulant bitches who locked themselves up in rooms, nailed the windows shut, so the common folks wouldn't know what was going on. And all they would do was argue with each other, name call each other, throw shade at each other, dirt at each other. People think modern politics are dirty. Not as dirty as politics were back then. A couple of fun facts about George Washington. He was one of the tallest presidents. He was extremely tall for his time. I think he was like 6'2". He was an amazing dancer. Apparently, he was a really good dancer, a hit with the ladies, never had any children. Of course, there's the long-standing myth that he had wooden teeth, which is not true. His teeth were made of animal teeth, as well as teeth pulled from the mouths of his own slaves. So obviously that's another stain on Washington, but we can't put today's standards in that context of time. So I'm not going to judge these presidents on slave ownership, because that's a very, very slippery slope. So let me obviously put George Washington obviously in the Mount Rushmore section. There's really, I don't know if this country would have stayed whole if it wasn't for George Washington. Let's see. Boo. Did George Washington have slaves? Yes, he did. He did set his slaves free after his death, but yeah, he owned slaves, as did most of the early presidents. Next president is John Adams. So the second election, well, again, the election for the second president was between Adams, who was the first vice president. He was vice president under Washington, and his opponent was Thomas Jefferson. And this was a dirty, and I mean dirty, presidential campaign. Adams spread the rumor, which wasn't a rumor, of Thomas Jefferson sleeping with his slaves, namely Sally Hemings, who we now know, of course, did happen, and he did father children with Sally Hemings. Thomas Jefferson accused John Adams of being a hermaphrodite. So there was a lot of shade thrown. There was a lot of dirt thrown. But Adams was the one who came out victorious. Now, as far as Adams goes, he did a lot of good for the country. And a lot of these early presidents, their presidency may have not been spectacular, but they did a lot of good prior to becoming president. So John Adams was very important to the Revolution. Again, I've mentioned it in previous videos. Thomas Jefferson usually gets all of the acclaim and all of the credit for writing the Declaration of Independence, which is not true. Thomas Jefferson did not pen the Declaration of Independence by himself. The Declaration of Independence was actually written by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Adams was also a very shrewd politician. Adams was, again, very important to the Revolution. But John Adams was not a very liked person, especially by the other founding fathers. And John Adams is the second president, but also the first president to only serve one term. Adams' biggest fault was the Alien and Sedition Act, which was completely unconstitutional. And basically anyone who disagreed with Adams, including the press, even though freedom of the press was guaranteed by the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, Adams tried to have all of that nullified with the Alien and Sedition Acts. John Adams, you know, he was the biggest thing he was most proud of was the peace that he forged with France. So after the Revolutionary War, France was obviously a huge help in America winning the Revolutionary War. Without France, it's not a done deal that America would have won the Revolutionary War, but there was trouble brewing after the Revolutionary War, and Adams helped basically cool the waters. And he was very, very proud of that. In fact, he insisted upon his death that actually be inscribed on his tombstone. He didn't want it to say that he was vice president. He didn't want it to say that he was president. He just wanted to say that he was responsible for the peace with France. That's it. That's all he wanted on his tombstone. So the Alien and Sedition Act is definitely one of the darkest moments in presidential history as far as abuse of presidential powers. And he basically alienated everyone in his life with the exception of, his wife. He was a very brutally honest person with no social skills whatsoever. And of course, the fun fact between Adams and Jefferson is they both die on the same day, on July 4th, 1826, which was actually the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And and it was funny because Adams's last words were, Jefferson lives, even though Jefferson had actually died earlier that morning. But yeah, that's how deep their connection was. So very interesting. But as far as Adams goes, I mean, based on his presidency, I do have to put him in the bad category. He was not a good president. He was too tumultuous. He was too angry. He was too proud, and he did very little good for this country. Next president is Thomas Jefferson. So, of course, Thomas Jefferson was wildly important to the Revolution, especially his diplomacy in France, writing, of course, the Declaration of Independence along with Adams and Franklin, but also writing a lot of other papers. As a person, I do not like Thomas Jefferson at all. I cannot stand. Thomas Jefferson was not a good person at all. LGK, fun fact, John Adams was actually the first president to be in the White. That is correct. John Adams was the first president to live in the White House. Yes. Do you think if Benjamin Franklin had become president, it would have been a good run? I don't think so. Franklin was not the type of guy to be at the head of things. Franklin more liked to work things behind the scenes. And also for the same reason that Hamilton never became president, aside from the fact that he got shot, of course, and killed by the sitting vice president at the time, Aaron Burr. Franklin was known to have a lot of sexual scandals. Franklin loved his women, and he loved a lot of women. So yeah. So anyway, back to Jefferson. So, of course, Jefferson, big claim to fame was doubling the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. So Jefferson purchases the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon at the time, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, and doubles the size of the country. This was extremely controversial at the time. Congress and the Senate were not pleased with this because they felt constitutionally Jefferson did not have the right to do that. But it was one of those, things left unsaid, so to speak, which is why we have a Supreme Court to decide if something is or is not constitutional. So it was not a super popular thing at the time where people were celebrating, like, oh my God, look what Jefferson did. He doubled the size of the country. Not everybody was happy about that. Also, under Jefferson's 2 terms, we have the Lewis and Clark expeditions. Jefferson, as far as some weird things about Jefferson, aside from the fact that he only gave 2 speeches in his 2 terms, 1 in each term. He actually set the precedent for actually mailing in the State of the Union address. And it's not until actually Woodrow Wilson in the 19-teens, over 100 years later, that Woodrow Wilson reinstates the president giving the State of the Union address in person in Congress. So that was an interesting precedent that he set. He also creates a Library of Congress by selling his library to the Library of Congress. So the Library of Congress was actually started from Jefferson's own personal collection. He sold it mainly because he was in debt. Jefferson was always in debt. Jefferson was consistently tinkering, redesigning, tearing down, rebuilding his home in Monticello. So Jefferson was broke a lot of the times. But aside from my feelings, Jefferson was going between a legendary and a great president. I have to put him as a legendary president. Absolutely. He did tremendous things for this country, tremendous strides for this country. Jefferson, he also invented the swivel chair, something also that you wouldn't expect. Again, is his fear of public speaking, which was kind of weird. And of course, his stance on slavery. But again, like I said, he and other early presidents, most of them were slave owners. Also, he never vetoed a single bill in all 8 years of his presidency. That's another interesting thing about Jefferson. So now we move on to the fourth president, and that would be James Monroe. James Madison. James Monroe comes next. So Madison. So, of course, the big thing that people mostly remember about James Madison is either the War of 1812, the White House being burned down by the British, or his wife's ice cream. So, yes, James Madison loved ice cream, as well as his wife. They were huge fans of ice cream. James Monroe is one of those presidents who his presidency, there wasn't anything super spectacular about it, but what he did prior to his presidency, a lot of these first presidents were extremely qualified, right? Like, they had done so many great things, so many great achievements. Madison's, of course, big achievement is being the majority author of the United States Constitution. Leading us through the War of 1812, kind of goes in the good and the bad side for Madison. Fun fact about Madison, he was our shortest president. He was either 5'3" or 5'4", and he weighed something like 100 pounds. So very, very tiny man as far as James Madison goes. But he did effectively handle the War of 1812, and he did correct a lot of policies that were left over from Adams and Jefferson's presidencies. But again, slave owner, right? So that's as far as James Monroe and his presidency. So there was nothing super spectacular about it. And again, I am judging only on their presidency, not what they did prior to it. So I would put James Madison as a good president. There was nothing super great. There was nothing super bad about it. But I'm not including their prior acts, such as writing the Constitution or things of that nature, right? Now we jump on to James Monroe. So James Monroe is another, interesting figure. James Monroe, his biggest legacy, of course, is the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that we as a country would intervene with any European power that tried to colonize land in America. And he did a lot to establish U.S. foreign policy. He was the first president who really went outside of our borders and tried to really reach out to other, foreign countries, foreign governments, to create relationships, basically. So James Monroe was an absolutely vital president. The big black eye on James Monroe was the Missouri Compromise, which was another compromise for slavery. So basically, again, just like the founding fathers didn't want to deal with slavery, the first four presidents didn't want to deal with slavery. And James Monroe also just basically kicked it down the road for the future, for the next president, with the Missouri Compromise. So that's a big con. But James Monroe also did buy Florida from Spain. So thanks to James Monroe, We have that little phallus hanging off the edge of the country, America's penis, Florida. And yeah, a weird fact about Monroe. I don't really know anything much about James Monroe, to be honest with you, as far as personal stuff. But either case, with Monroe, due to his stance on foreign policy and everything else, I want to put him at great, but the Missouri Compromise knocks him down to good. He could have started something really great to heal this country when it comes to basically this nation's, darkest sin, which is slavery. Monroe had the opportunity and he passed it up with the Missouri Compromise, and that's why I got to knock him down a peg. That's that good stuff. Let's see. Want to see if we have any interesting questions here. Didn't he try and fight a diplomat with a fire poker or something like that? I don't know. I never heard of that one. Definitely sounds like something Andrew Jackson would have done. This will be interesting. I don't know much about some of the presidents. Okay, cool. So we're here to learn, like I said. All right, so next, after Monroe, we have John Quincy Adams. So this is a first, but not a last. So John Quincy Adams is the son of the second president, John Adams. So there are actually a number of presidents who do have familial ties. Of course, most recently, we had Bush 41 and Bush 43 as a father and son duo. But this is the first president, father and son tandem, so to speak. So John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was an absolutely brilliant politician. John Quincy Adams really worked hard on, whereas, again, James Monroe was more into the foreign policy. John Quincy Adams was more into, let's keep building America. So he did a lot to improve infrastructure in America, creating roads, creating canals, to basically help to connect the country more, right? Especially now that the country had doubled in size. So that was a big deal. John Quincy Adams, the biggest issue with John Quincy Adams is he ran against Andrew Jackson, and he beat Andrew Jackson narrowly. I mean, narrowly. It was a tumultuous election. It was a dirty election, and there were some backdoor deals made, and John Quincy Adams never quite had the respect of the legislative branch, Congress and the Senate. They felt he was a fraudulent president, and they felt that Andrew Jackson should have won. So while he did, do a lot of good, and he was an absolutely just amazing politician, brilliant man, honest to a T. But again, just like his father, he alienated a lot of people, but not as much with his personality as with his drive. So as far as, John Quincy Adams goes, the other interesting thing about John Quincy Adams was every morning he loved to go skinny dipping in the Potomac River. He felt that it was very healthy to go swimming in the nude. So as far as John Quincy Adams goes, I put him in the good category. He wasn't a bad president. but he wasn't a great president either. Now we get to Andrew Jackson. So again, like I'm saying, I'm not putting my personal beliefs, but Andrew Jackson was a deplorable human being. Andrew Jackson was not a good person whatsoever. He was really the first big catalyst in creating what we now know as the two-party system. So prior to that, there were many different parties, right? We don't have the Republican Party yet, right? But Andrew Jackson forms the Democratic Party, which is completely different from the Democratic Party we know of today. Just like the Republican Party of Lincoln is nothing like the Republican Party today, right? But Andrew Jackson forms the Democratic Party in order to defeat John Quincy Adams finally. But again, in doing so, he's basically the first catalyst in creating the two-party system. Instead of, at least if we're going to have parties, to have multiple parties, instead of just only two recognizable parties. He had a lot of black eyes as far as his presidency goes. With Andrew Jackson, you had the Trail of Tears with the Native Americans. He ended the charter of the Bank of the United States, which led to the Panic of 1837, which was, again, a very, very trying time. The main good things that he did as far as his presidency, he is the first and only president to actually pay off the entire national debt. He's the only president to have a zero national debt. It only happened that one time, and that's it. But again, Andrew Jackson, it's tough, man. It's really tough. I'm going between good and bad. I mean, it's just barely. I got to go bad. Andrew Jackson was, he did do a few good things here and there, but he did a lot more bad than he did good. Again, I know he's on the $20 bill and everything. But again, this is just my personal opinion based on, my knowledge, of these men. Some people may disagree, but I can't put Andrew Jackson any higher than that. I'm not putting him in the Satan category, but anyway. So next we have one of the most badass hairdos in presidential history, Martin Van Buren, and those bitchin' mutton chop sideburns. Look at them sideburns, man. Them sideburns are chef's kiss. Martin Van Buren. So Martin Van Buren, obviously not one of the most well-known presidents. Van Buren, the most interesting thing about Van Buren is he's actually the first president who was born a United States citizen, meaning every president who preceded them was either, again, founding father, so America was not a country yet, or had come from a different country. So he was the first person who was not of British or Irish ancestry. Martin Van Buren was actually Dutch. And he is also, unlike the previous presidents, he was not a well-to-do man, meaning he grew up dirt poor. He grew up in poverty. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. These were wealthy. These were among the wealthiest people in the country. At one point, George Washington was the wealthiest man in the United States. Whereas Martin Van Buren really just came from nothing and literally pulled himself up by his American bootstraps, so to speak. Martin Van Buren, again, nothing really bad in his presidency. The Panic of 1837, which was a financial panic, he didn't handle it great. But again, we're talking about something that was left over mainly from Andrew Jackson. And the other thing that is an interesting fact about Martin Van Buren is the term okay actually comes from Martin Van Buren. So when Martin Van Buren was running for president, his nickname was Old Kinderhook because he came from Kinderhook, New York. And so they started to abbreviate it just by saying okay on the signs that they would carry. So the expression okay that we use now actually comes from Martin Van Buren. It's actually a fun fact about Van Buren. He was not, again, a formidable person, also pretty short. But again, nothing spectacular about his presidency that really jumps out, but nothing really bad either. Again, just in the middle, Martin Van Buren. Now we come to William Henry Harrison. So William Henry Harrison is, of course, famous for being president for a month. So this is an easy, just not applicable. He didn't do anything. He was president for 30 days, 30-something days, and he was sick pretty much the entire time. So William Henry Harrison really doesn't do anything in office. So there's really nothing to judge. William Henry Harrison, of course, gets sick because he gives the longest inauguration address in history. It was an hour and a half. It was an extremely cold day. It had also been raining. He didn't want to wear an overcoat, and he got sick, and he died a month later. So that's about it. There's really not much to talk about. So now we have the first president to die in office, which is William Henry Harrison. So now the big question, who becomes president? There's actually, at the time, there was nothing in the Constitution that stated what happens if a president dies in office. And in reality, we don't have it until the 25th Amendment. So John Tyler, basically, the biggest contribution he made to the presidency was convincing everyone that, yeah, the vice president becomes president. That's it, right? There was a huge disagreement over the power of the vice president, but John Tyler pretty much convinced everyone. He's like, come on, guys, why are we even talking about this? He was just acting like it was a matter of a fact thing. He wasn't even listening to the opposition. He wasn't listening to the Supreme Court. He wasn't listening to anything. He's like, why? Come on, man. Why are we messing around here? Why are we even talking about this? Right? But aside from that, he was one of the most despised presidents we ever had. He pretty much everybody hated John Tyler. He even got kicked out of his own political party. They kicked out a sitting president from his own political party. His entire cabinet resigned over his policies. He was the first president to face impeachment, even though he was not impeached. He's not the first president to be impeached. That happens later. But he's the first person who was brought up on impeachment charges. He was described as just a miserable, despicable, and not the sharpest tool in the shed. So, yeah, I mean, as far as John Tyler goes, I mean, there's really nothing good about John Tyler's presidency. The only thing was that he fought Congress to establish the precedent that the vice president becomes president if the president dies. The other big black eye on John Tyler, to show you what a piece of shit this guy was, once the Civil War breaks out, he actually goes and serves with the Confederate States. He switches sides, man. So yeah, this is another pretty easy choice as far as John Tyler goes. Not necessarily Hail Satan bad, but a bad president. John Tyler was not a good president at all. Now we come to James K. Polk. So Polk was an interesting president for a few reasons. He's not one of the best known presidents, but he accomplished a great many things. A lot of institutions were built under his presidency. The most famous one being the Smithsonian Institution. The first postage stamps were issued under his presidency. The U.S. Naval Academy. So under his presidency, he created a lot of institutions. Polk's biggest, I would say, negative, his treatment of our neighbors to the north and south. He was not very good to Mexico and Canada. But again, I mean, he didn't do anything like crazy terrible. So with James K. Polk, was he a great president? No, but he was a good president. I would put Polk definitely as a good president. Let me check in with the chat room. What's going on? Let's see. The previous presidents were born in the land that would become the U.S. That is correct, although some of them were born overseas as well. Who else is the point? What else is the point of a vice president? Yeah, well, I mean, there are other duties that the vice president performs, but yeah, John Adams, who was the first vice president, famously said it is the most ridiculous office that has ever been created and one of the biggest waste of time and space that there can be. He was miserable as vice president. Who goes in Hail Satan then, other than the obvious? Well, I don't know what's obvious to you, but there are going to be quite a few that do eventually start going in there. Especially once we get to around the Civil War, secession. Yeah, there's going to be a couple that are going to go in there very shortly. So after John Tyler, we get Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor is, oh boy, he threatened to veto the Compromise of 1850, and tried his best. He did try to prevent secession. As far as his presidency, again, he was a slave owner, but he did help at least set the stage for abolition. He brings in California into the United States. He was, I mean, again, he at least tried to do something about slavery and abolitionism, even though he himself was a slaveholder. His biggest black eye, I would say, is, you know, it was almost like he was all talk, really, is what it boils down to, as far as Zachary Taylor. Nothing really much happens during his time in office. As far as the way he died. That's what I was thinking of. Really, the only interesting fact about him is the way he dies. So he also dies in office. He was president for about a year and a half. So one day, while celebrating the 4th of July, Zachary Taylor decided to have a snack. And the snack was some cherries which he washed down with some ice milk. And apparently there was bacteria that was present in either the cherries or the milk, which led to a stomach ache. And then a few days later, he was dead. So he didn't get cut down by an assassin's bullet. He got cut down by some cherries and milk. That was the thing. I was trying to remember if it was him or if it was Fillmore. But yeah, it was him. It was Zachary Taylor. So again, I mean, you know, he talked a good game. Who knows if he would have followed through with what happened. But again, he was only president for a year and a half. So really, I got to throw him in also the not applicable category because there's just not much to judge him on, you know? So then we get one of the most interesting names in presidential history. We get Millard Fillmore. So Millard Fillmore, when you're saying he was all talk, so you're saying he was a U.S. president. Yeah, pretty much. Good point. Good point. Fair. I can't argue with that. So Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore was another one-term president. He basically just ended out Zachary Taylor's term. So he was president for about 2.5 years. There's really not much to say about him. He really did absolutely nothing. The only interesting thing about Millard Fillmore is that he married his school teacher. So, yeah, too hot for... What was that Van Halen song? Too hot for teacher? Yeah, he was hot for teacher. But, yeah, I mean, most historians, I mean, when you mention him, it's like, he was a president. I mean, that's about it. But yeah, there's just not much to say. So I think he also has to fall into that category of just didn't really do anything. He wasn't president long enough. So at this point, I am going to take a quick break because I have to go and make the peepees, and I will be right back. All right, fam, I'm back. So, just quickly, I just want to plug a couple of things. For those of you who know, some of you may not know, I'm streaming this right now live on YouTube, but also on Twitch. And all of the links are in the description. So on Twitch, every Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, I just started a podcast with a co-host. My co-host's name is Allie. She is our dragon queen from Australia. And the show is called Getting Strange. So we do it live on Twitch every Tuesday, 9 p.m. But every Thursday after the show, it is published on pretty much every single major podcast platform. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts, all that stuff. So you can listen either on the podcast version or you can watch live with us. And basically what we do is we talk about every taboo subject you can think of. Our first show was about online dating, do's and don'ts. This week, we're going to be doing communication in relationships, which is very important. Our second episode was how to spot crazy when you're dating. So those are the type of subjects we talk about, and we take questions from the audience. And also this week, on Thursday, we're premiering Getting Strange True Crime Edition. So we're going to be talking about historical scandals, true crime events. Our first One will be Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, which is the original Hollywood Scandal. So I just wanted to plug that. If you haven't done that, I really appreciate the support on that. So our next president, will you rate more modern presidents? Yeah, I'm going to rate everyone all the way up to Donald Trump. I'm not rating Biden because he's still in office. So there's nothing to rate yet. So next we get Franklin Pierce. So Franklin Pierce is a tough one. Franklin Pierce is really a tragic person. He was not a very popular president, nor was he an effective president. President. He was the first president to actually have to hire a full-time bodyguard, and not like the Secret Service. It was just because people literally wanted to beat him up. I mean, the only time you really hear about Franklin Pierce is in a lot of polls, he's voted as the hottest president. But have y'all ever seen a young Gerald Ford? The man was a model. But I guess as far as sitting presidents goes, yeah, Franklin Pierce, yeah. But again, he was another president who had the opportunity to do something about slavery, but then with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, once again, just kicking it down the line and, hey, handle it later, right? Any pros to his presidency? He was the first president to have a Christmas tree in the White House. But he was a tragic person in the sense that he watched his only son die right before his eyes. His son was actually decapitated right in front of him, and that basically broke him for the rest of his life. He became an alcoholic. He became a very obstinate and misanthropic person. So again, with Franklin Pierce, it's rough because, like I said, he really didn't do anything. One-term president. So he did serve a full term. I have to put him in the bad category. He was not a good president. He really just did absolutely nothing. So you were asking before, but here comes your answer. James Buchanan. Buchanan was definitely a president who left a very, very bad legacy. Absolutely did not want to hear anything about abolition or ending slavery. And he is the president who pretty much lost the grip on the seceding nations and left Abraham Lincoln with an absolute mess. So James Buchanan, again, I really can't think of anything positive that he did. As far as James Buchanan, I mean, even when you look at his face, he just looks like a piece of shit. Buchanan, the thing he's most remembered for is he was the only bachelor in the White House. So the only thing that's really remembered about him is the assumption that James Buchanan was our first gay president. He was never married. He was the only bachelor president. The person that he was suspected as to having a relationship with was William Rufus King. He was a senator out of Alabama. The two of them lived together. Despite being extremely wealthy, they could have lived apart. But even Andrew Jackson famously called them Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. Andrew Jackson made no qualms about calling them out. Yeah, I mean, as far as our first, yeah, Buchanan has to go into that Hail Satan category. He was not just a bad president. He took this country down an extremely dark path. And then again, like I said, with Washington, again, this is a no-brainer. Just like with Washington, Lincoln was right man at the right time. I mean, thank whatever you believe in, God, Vishnu, Muhammad, Joe Pesci, Captain Crunch, whatever it is. Thank Captain Crunch for Abraham Lincoln. A lot of people forget just how shrewd Abraham Lincoln was. Like, we have the whole, the honest Abe vision of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a hustler. Abraham Lincoln knew how to manipulate people. Abraham Lincoln knew how to get people on his side. Abraham Lincoln knew how to push buttons. Abraham Lincoln knew how to get things done. And again, right man for the right time. An absolutely brilliant president, one of our most intelligent presidents. I mean, there's really not much you really need to say about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln saved the United States. The biggest black mark on his presidency was suspending habeas corpus. Was it necessary? It could be argued that it was, but it could also be argued that it wasn't. But aside from that, there is no question about Abraham Lincoln's legacy and everything he did. It's the only shame is we never got to see, because as soon as Lincoln is inaugurated, the Civil War is on. So we never really got to see what Lincoln could have and would have done post-Civil War. Would the country's direction be different? Absolutely. Would it be different for the better? Absolutely, no doubt. But again, it's all about who knows. Some interesting facts about Lincoln. Again, people look at Lincoln as this feeble, honest, just good old guy, right? Lincoln was, of course, our tallest president. And Lincoln was also a tough guy, man. Lincoln had over 300 wrestling matches, and he only lost once, and even that was controversial. So he was apparently an amazing wrestler. So if he was around today, he'd definitely be doing some AEW, WWE type stuff. But yeah, Lincoln is God tier. Lincoln is Mount Rushmore. And then, unfortunately, of course, in April of 1865, Abraham Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater, and history, unfortunately, changes for the worse. Definitely for the worse. And the man who replaces him is the complete polar opposite. And there's going to be an interesting fact when we get to John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. So the man who ascends to the presidency is Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, I'm putting him all the way at the front of the line as far as Hail Satan goes. In my opinion, the worst president we ever had it's not even close. Andrew Johnson set this country back a century. Because it's not until 1964 that the Civil Rights Act gets signed into law. We get Reconstruction destroyed. We get Jim Crow. We get lynching. We get separate but equal. And this all leads back to Andrew Johnson, who was the first president to actually be impeached. He was saved just by one single vote, And actually, that one single vote was running late. They were running late when they were impeaching, when they were holding the vote for the impeachment. And they said that they were going to vote to impeach, but it was kind of fishy that they were running late. But also, aside from that, James Buchanan was consistently interfering with the Supreme Court. Most famously, the Dred Scott case, the Kansas elections, which then results in the Kansas affair. I mean, just awful human being, awful president. There's not one single solitary thing that positive that he did. He did have a terrible childhood, yes. After his father died, his mother sent him and his little brother out to work as indentured servants. Johnson and his brother then end up running away from their mother. You know, he did have a rough childhood, but that's no excuse for the atrocities that he ends up committing against this country. So that's a definite easy hail Satan. After Andrew Johnson thankfully only serves out the rest of Lincoln's term. So he's just that one-term president. We get 8 years of Ulysses S. Grant. So Grant was actually supposed to be in Lincoln's theater box on the night of the assassination, but he changed his mind at the last minute about going to the play, and he regretted it for the rest of his life because he felt if he was there, he could have stopped it. But the interesting thing about Grant is he was, just like Washington, the general of the Civil War. But he was petrified about the sight of blood. And the Civil War was one of the bloodiest wars in history. In American history, definitely it was the bloodiest war. But he couldn't stand the sight of blood. But during his presidency, he did successfully dismantle the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. Unfortunately, decades later, they did regroup. Especially under Woodrow Wilson. But Ulysses S. Grant is a tough one. He's tough to judge because he was unfortunately extremely trusting of his cabinet, which was extremely corrupt. And there were several different scandals during his presidency, which he was not a part of or aware of, but that also goes to the fact that he was kind of an aloof person. He was not the most intelligent person. He was a very inspiring person, but he was just too naive as president. So with Grant, it's hard because he wasn't a bad president. He was just not presidential material, but I'll put him in the good category. And now we have a string of awfulness that is going to come. So after Grant, we get Rutherford B. Hayes. You may know him as the former guitarist for ZZ Top. Rutherford B. Hayes. What can you really say about Rutherford B. Hayes? It was one of the most, the thing he's remembered most for is really the election. It was one of the closest and most contested elections in U.S. history. Closer even than Gore and Bush in 2000. Rutherford B. Hayes lost the popular vote and eventually was awarded the presidency. But after a bitter battle between the two parties, Rutherford B. Hayes continues what Andrew Johnson started. So Rutherford B. Hayes is basically the Kylo Ren to Andrew Johnson's Darth Vader. He's like, I will finish what you started. Rutherford B. Hayes ends Reconstruction early, which then gives way for the rise of Jim Crow in the South. He was the first president to host an Easter hunt in the White House, if that helps. Kind of like Franklin Pierce had the first Christmas tree. But yeah, I mean, as far as Rutherford B. Hayes goes, aside from the disputed election, he was also known for just kind of being like a no fun guy, like a party pooper, because he didn't drink, he didn't smoke, he didn't gamble, like he didn't do nothing. Was he Hail Satan worthy? No, but definitely a bad president. Then we get James A. Garfield. James A. Garfield, there's not much you can really say. James A. Garfield was assassinated just a few months into his presidency, so he really didn't have time to do anything. He was the first president to have air conditioning. That's something. But yeah, he barely made it through. I think he was president for like 6 months or something like that. So yeah, really not much as far as Garfield, goes. The most famous thing again was the way Garfield died. So Garfield was not mortally wounded when he was shot. It was basically the doctors and, of all people, Alexander Graham Bell, who ended up killing Garfield. So he was shot, but he didn't die until like 3 months later. He was alive for another 3 months after getting shot. So the doctors tried leeches. They were sticking their unwashed fingers into his body, into the bullet hole wounds. But basically what kind of finished him was Alexander Graham Bell was in town. And Alexander Graham Bell had invented a new type of metal detector. And so he said he could help out in finding, because the big issue was they couldn't locate the bullets that Garfield was shot with. So Alexander Graham Bell says, hey, I'm going to come by with my new invention, like he's Doc Brown. So the issue was the doctors started cutting poor Garfield like all over his abdomen because the metal detector kept on going off until all the geniuses in the room realized, wait, aren't there metal springs in the mattress that he's laying on? Yeah, that's what was setting off the metal detector. The goddamn metal springs in the mattress. So basically, Alexander Graham Bell is more responsible for the death of Garfield than the assassin was. Yeah, it was pretty bad. But James Garfield is in that non-applicable category because he just didn't have enough time to do anything. And again, the most memorable thing about him is, again, the way he died. Now we get Chester A. Arthur, good old Chester Alan Arthur, another one-term president who was more interested in redecorating the White House than actually being president. He wanted all new furniture in the White House, but the White House was like, yo, son, we ain't got that type of money right now, all right? We just went through a civil war. We've been having a rough time. We ain't got that kind of money. So what does Chester A. Arthur decide to do? He decides to have a yard sale. Except unlike most people who have a yard sale and sell off some like Franklin Mint plates and some Matchbox cars, he unloads wagonfuls of historical relics from the White House. President's hats, president's clothing, silverware. I mean, it was just ridiculous. that's really all I remember about Chester A. Arthur, to be honest with you. He was one of the few presidents in this time who was for civil rights. He did try to work to improve conditions for not just African Americans, but Native Americans. But unfortunately, pretty much everything he tried to do was blocked by Congress, and of course, Southern Democrats. So he really didn't accomplish anything. Again, just ho-hum presidency. But the only good thing was, in the midst of all these awful presidents, he at least wasn't, a piece of shit. So Chester Alan Arthur, it's tough. I hate calling him a bad president, but again, he had good intentions. He just couldn't get shit done. So does that make him a bad president or a good president? You know what? For the times, and again, he at least tried, unlike his predecessors. So I'll give old Chester Arthur a break here. Now we got Grover Cleveland. So of course the biggest thing that Grover Cleveland is remembered for is being the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So what that means is he was president, then he got beaten, then he ran again, and he was reelected president. So he has the dubious distinction, Grover Cleveland, of being, what was it, I'm trying to remember. It was either the 24th? I don't remember, but he's listed as 2 different presidents. Yeah. So Grover Cleveland may be the most disgusting president we've ever had. So there were 2 main incidents with good old Grover Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland, like many presidents, was a lawyer. And he had a law partner. And when his law partner passed away, his law partner had asked Cleveland if Cleveland would become the legal guardian of his 11-year-old daughter, because his wife had died as well, so she was an orphan. So Cleveland took her in, became her legal guardian, became her father at 11 years old. Fast forward 10 years, once she turned 21, he married her in the White House, making her the youngest first lady ever, and making him the Woody Allen of the 19th century. But just before you go off and go, wow, man, that's kind of shady, bruh. You raise this girl as your daughter, and as soon as she's legal, you marry her while being president. Imagine that scandal today. But what's even worse was Grover Cleveland raped a woman before becoming president, and then proceeded to torment this poor woman by having her committed to an insane asylum and having her child taken away from her and put in an orphanage to protect the scandal. And then had her painted in the press, because the story broke when he was running for president, that he had assaulted this woman and all the terrible things that he had done to her by having her committed, having her child taken away, put in an orphanage. And they basically painted it as she was a crazy woman. She was an adulterer. She was a alcoholic. She was doing the drugs. So Grover Cleveland, easily, because also he really never did anything positive as president. Again, the only thing he's known for is either being the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, for having the youngest first lady, who was his daughter as well, kind of, and also destroying a woman and a child's life to cover up his own scandal. And also ineffectively handling anything as president. So Grover Cleveland, both times. I'll put him as number one. No, I'll keep Johnson first. Johnson and then Grover Cleveland twice as Hail Satans. I told you we were going to fill up these Hail Satans. There's more to come. Let me check the chat here. 22nd and 24th. Thank you so much. Groper Cleveland. Yeah. There was his opponents did have a song about him. And about he also had an illegitimate child as well. But yeah. America had no great president. No, there are going to be some great presidents. Again, but unfortunately, they're just few and far in between. Especially when we're talking about 19th century presidents, because we're talking about people who still believed in slavery, inequality, and everything else. But there'll be some great presidents as well. We got a bunch of good presidents. We got a legend. We got 2 Mount Rushmores. So anyway, so in between the 2 Grover Cleveland administrations, we had Benjamin Harrison. So Benjamin Harrison was related to William Henry Harrison. He was his grandson. Yeah. So they remain the only grandson and grandfather tandem. We had John Adams and John Quincy Adams were father and son, as well as the 2 Bushes. But the Harrisons are the only grandson, grandfather. So Benjamin Harrison was the grandson of William Henry Harrison. He was known, his nickname was the Human Iceberg, because he just had no desire to speak with people. He was completely socially inept. He was very anxious as well. But he was the first president to have electricity in the White House. But he was so scared of the electricity, he refused to touch any of the light switches, and he would always go to bed with all the lights on. He refused to turn them off because he was just petrified. He's like, "What sorcery is this? How dare you?" That was about it. His administration was really more about, he had his grandson, Baby McKee. Baby McKee was, I mean, it was like an obsession. It was kind of like the Royal Children, or like Kanye and Slutface's kids, North by Northwest, whatever their kid's name is. The country was just in love with his grandson, Baby McKee. But again, Benjamin Harrison, nothing spectacular about his presidency. I mean, just not memorable. I mean, so Benjamin Harrison, not a great president, not a good president. I mean, if I had a ho-hum category, I'd put him in there. So of course, after Benjamin Harrison, we get Grover Cleveland again, but we already covered that. So after Cleveland's second term, we get William McKinley. So with William McKinley ends up serving almost all of his presidency. He was shot by an assassin, and he died late into the 3rd year of his term. So he almost fulfilled the entire 4 years of his presidency. As far as his accomplishments, he tried to establish, several different traditions when it came to campaign reform. There was nothing really, again, that stands out about his presidency. As far as some slights on his presidency, occupying the Philippines and suppressing its independence movement after the Spanish-American War was a big black eye on it. So again, just another ho-hum president as far as McKinley goes. If it wasn't for the assassination, I doubt anybody would remember anything about him. So just another, like I said, just a long line of bad presidents. But we do get some reprise, because now we get Theodore Roosevelt, one of the baddest men on the planet. So Theodore Roosevelt becomes the youngest president, but not the youngest elected president, because he was vice president under McKinley. And then after McKinley's assassination, Theodore Roosevelt was sworn in as president at the age of 42. So he was the youngest president ever, but not the youngest elected president. Roosevelt was one of the most charismatic people. He really brought life back into an office that was just, again, viewed as completely ineffectual, inept, corrupt. He was the first president to refer to the White House as the White House. He, of course, signs many different acts that are still to this day monumental, whether it's his Parks Act, whether it's his monopoly busting, all the different monopolies, and of course the Panama Canal. But the Panama Canal, the road to it was not paved in sunshine and rainbows. So in order to orchestrate his dream for the Panama Canal, Roosevelt basically orchestrated the Panamanian Rebellion against Colombia. So it was one of the first times that America basically participated in covert operations in foreign countries in order to meet their goals, so to speak. But Theodore Roosevelt did amazing things for this country. Aside from his treatment of the Philippines, Theodore Roosevelt, also fun fact, the reason we have the teddy bear is because of Teddy Roosevelt. Of course, Roosevelt is also famous for when he tried to run for a third term. He was about to go in to give a speech when he was shot in the chest. And the only thing that stopped it was he had an eyeglass case, and also he had a thick speech. He was going to give a long ass speech. So even though he had been shot in the chest and he was covered in blood, he still walked in and gave that speech and then went to the hospital. Theodore Roosevelt, even though he is on Mount Rushmore, I'm going to put him in the legendary category. He's not quite Mount Rushmore material, as far as I'm concerned, at least. Neither is Thomas Jefferson, even though Jefferson is on Mount Rushmore. So after the two terms with Theodore Roosevelt, we get William Henry Taft. So Taft was a very interesting person. He was a one-term president, but he is still to this day the only president after his presidency to go on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. A lot of people don't know that. It's a very interesting fact about him. The biggest thing that most people do remember about Taft is he was a big boy. He was a BBW. Or would it be a BBM? He was a BBM. But absolutely brilliant thinker, brilliant academic. Again, there was a reason he wasn't just appointed to the Supreme Court, but as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was appointed about either like 6 or 7 years after his presidency. And he was much happier being that than being president. And then there's the whole myth that he got stuck in a bathtub because he was so thick. Whether it's true or not, who knows, but it makes for a fun story. But as far as his presidency goes, really his presidency was, again, very ho-hum. Really not much about it. He definitely went on to do much better things in the Supreme Court, but he wasn't a bad president, but he also wasn't a great president. He was a much better Supreme Court justice than he was a president. Now we get to one of the most divisive presidents. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a tough one. Because Wilson, aside from being after, as I mentioned before, Ulysses S. Grant, basically disbands and ends the Ku Klux Klan. No other person did more to bring the Ku Klux Klan back than Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson did not do much to hide his affinity nor his membership in the KKK. Wilson also brought the United States into World War I. A lot of people, of course, don't really remember World War I nowadays. I mean, World War II, yes. The other big issue with Wilson's presidency is his second term. So during his second term, Wilson begins to suffer debilitating strokes. And for the last 2 years of his presidency, it is widely accepted by most historians that he did not perform any acts as president. And in fact, his wife was running the entire thing. So that was obviously, today, of course, it wouldn't pass with, just cameras everywhere and press briefings, but it was a different time. But Wilson, I mean, again, getting the U.S. into World War I, immediately after his reelection, where he promised he was going to keep America out of the war. And he just created a geopolitical mess that eventually then led to World War II with the Treaty of Versailles, which then led to the Cold War, which then led to. So for all of this, I mean, hail Satan. Woodrow Wilson was a terrible human being and probably an even worse president. Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding is the OG, like Bill Clinton, except dumber. Warren G. Harding is most remembered for all of the orgies, poker games, gambling away White House relics. Jackson Ferguson, I don't agree with your ranking on Abraham Lincoln. If you are going to rank with that, that's fine. But as a president of America, he wasn't really that good. His law banning slavery only worked on the South. Yeah, because there was no slavery in the North. Who learned you how to rote and spoke? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. His law banning slavery only worked in the South. Yes, because slavery was all in the South. There were no slaves in the North. That's the whole point. Oh, Jesus Christ. Anyway, but we did get some decent Call of Duty games. All right, I'll give you that one. We wouldn't have, my son, Jacob loves Call of Duty Cold War, so I'll give you that one. But anywho, back to the fuckery. So Warren G. Harding, again, his presidency, really, aside from scandals and allegedly conceiving a side baby in one of the White House closets, I mean, he was the person who signed the treaty that did end World War One, but he wasn't really, he wasn't really involved in that. He was the first president elected after women had gained the right to vote, because for whatever reason, I mean, the man was a player. What can I say? Then there was the Teapot Dome scandal. There was the Virginia Bureau scandal. I mean, he was just an awful president. An awful president. Yeah, bad. I mean, he wasn't Hail Satan bad, but he was bad. And then we get Calvin Coolidge. Cool Cal. The Cool Meister. So Calvin Coolidge obviously follows Warren G. Harding. As far as his presidency, he was the only, fun fact, the only president to be born on the 4th of July. The pluses in his corner was his work towards civil rights. Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, which gave full citizenship to all Native Americans. The Calvin Coolidge gets a bad rap as president. So as far as Calvin Coolidge goes, I would say that Calvin Coolidge was a good president, a very good president, who just gets a bad rap for things. And also he had a daily ritual of having somebody rub Vaseline in his head while he laid in bed, which definitely sounds like a kink to me. So kudos for that. Then after that, we get Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover. It's tough to judge Herbert Hoover, to blame the collapse of Wall Street in 1929, which was just several months into his presidency. But he took all the blame for it. So when the stock market crashed, which led again to the Great Depression, and not just in the United States, but worldwide, it's hard because to blame it on Hoover, is completely unfair. Because again, it happened just, several months into his presidency. He didn't do anything to cause it. So the Great Depression usually gets tacked on to Herbert Hoover. Then he raised taxes. But unfortunately, the economy, of course, continued to spiral out of control. Then you had the Hoovervilles. Then passing the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which basically all they did, instead of, he thought it was going to help the economy, but really all it did was exacerbate the panic after the 1929 crash. And as far as facts about him, he was kind of a dick. But the interesting fact about him and his wife, they lived in China for a good period of time, and they both spoke Mandarin Chinese. So whenever they wanted to talk shit about people in the White House, they would just start talking in Mandarin. But Herbert Hoover, again, I put him in a good category because I think he just gets too much blame. So yeah, I wouldn't say he was a bad president. It was just a bad time. And then we get one of the, if we ever do it, people do top lists. This man is usually in the top 5 somewhere. FDR, not related to Theodore Roosevelt. In fact, Franklin's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was the one who was related to Theodore Roosevelt, but Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were cousins. So Eleanor Roosevelt didn't have to change her name to Eleanor Roosevelt when she married FDR. Her name was already Roosevelt. Yeah, they were cousins. So with FDR, of course, FDR is the president who not just leads us out of the Depression, but leads us through probably the greatest conflict of the 20th century in World War II. Roosevelt is the man who makes America a superpower. America really had no air force to speak of until Roosevelt challenged this country and brought this country together to gather all of the resources necessary to build 100,000 planes. And most people thought it was impossible. His social programs, yes, a lot of them didn't work, but just like FDR said, just because some of them don't work doesn't mean I'm going to stop trying. So Social Security, FDR, right? To give people a safety net in the future. So FDR, I mean, it's hard to not say that FDR belongs on the Mount Rushmore. I got to put him on the Mount Rushmore of presidents. Of course, the only president to be elected for a third term and a fourth term. So that was FDR. After FDR, so FDR dies during his fourth term. He dies of a heart attack. And then Harry Truman has to take over. So Roosevelt never lives to see the end of the war. So give him hell, Harry. Harry Truman was one of the biggest underdogs. Like if any president could be compared to that movie Rudy about the Notre Dame kid who wanted to play football, it'd be Harry Truman. Harry Truman was scrappy as all hell. So Harry Truman is put in the position, and very difficult position, of ending World War II on the Pacific Front, and making the decision to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. Right, wrong, would there have been more casualties if the war dragged on? You know, those are conversations, of course, that were had, and that was the decision that was made. But Truman picked up right where Roosevelt left off. After the end of World War II, Truman brought an era of peace and prosperity in the United States into the 50s, from the 40s into the 50s, that was really unprecedented. He also, unfortunately, presided over the beginnings of the next big conflicts that were going to come, which was the Korean War, and then, of course, eventually the Cold War. As far as his biggest fault in office, definitely pulling out of South Korea and escalating, pushing the United Nations troops into Korea, which made the Korean conflict much worse than it should have been. But he is somebody who, at the time, may have not been super popular. I gotta say, Harry Truman, I think, is going to be our first great president. He's not quite legendary. He's not just good. He's great. So there you go. Our first great president is Harry S. Truman. The other interesting fact, the S stands for absolutely nothing. The S stands for nothing. So after Harry Truman serves his 2 terms, we get the great general of World War II. We get Dwight David Eisenhower, after whom Camp David is named after his grandson, David. So he had 2 extremely successful terms, possibly the most popular president we ever had. During his presidency in the 50s, great prosperity, a lot of troops after returning home. Obviously, we start having the baby boom, but a lot of the troops using the GI Bill get, educations. Eisenhower brings us the interstate highway system. During Eisenhower's term, we get the end of segregation in schools and in the military. As he famously said, there cannot be any second-class citizens in this country. Just a lot of good was done. His popularity was through the roof during his presidency. I think his popularity fell below 50% one time during his entire presidency. I can't really even think of anything negative to say about Eisenhower. So Eisenhower, I think, goes in the same category. I would have to... I almost wouldn't put him up here, but definitely legend. Eisenhower was an absolute legend. And one of the greatest, again, aside from Washington's farewell address, I would definitely 100% suggest that you could actually watch it because it was filmed. You can watch his farewell address. Let's see. Calvin Coolidge sounds like a beverage. It does, actually. Herbert Hoover, his spirit animal was a beaver. Think about it. Oh, my goodness. Oh, boy. Let's see. Did that guy ever answer me? No, he didn't. So I guess he figured out he sounded like an idiot. Anyway, so getting back to our list. So now we're getting into the 1960s. So now we're getting into the home stretch, fam. John F. Kennedy. This is a tough one. So John F. Kennedy beats Richard Nixon. Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years. And Kennedy kind of comes out of nowhere. It was a very, very, very close election. All those rumors you hear about the Chicago mob and his father, Joe Kennedy, buying that's all nonsense. I actually discussed it in my presidential iceberg video. That's all nonsense. That there's no truth to that. It was just a very, very close election. And Kennedy narrowly beats out Nixon, and thank God. The thing that really wins Kennedy the election in 1960 is the televised debates. It was the first televised presidential debates. And Kennedy just looked smooth as a cucumber. Kennedy was cool, calm. He just seemed presidential. Whereas Nixon was fumbling his words, stuttering, sweating like a madman. It was just not a good look. The only reason it was so close was that Kennedy was an Irish Catholic. So that was a big thing. There had never been a Catholic president. And a lot of people did fear that there would be foreign influences, mainly, of course, the Catholic Church, the Pope, all that stuff. So that was the big concern with Kennedy by a lot of people. And also his stance on civil rights, of course, as well. But Kennedy does win. Kennedy then inherits the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was after Castro took over Cuba in 1959 when he overthrew Batista. America was already had its sights set on getting Castro the hell out of there. So the Eisenhower administration starts planning the Bay of Pigs invasion. There was some debate that whether Kennedy knew about it or not, but Kennedy definitely knew about it. But it wasn't his own idea or, invention or anything like that. Kennedy does mess up because he did not send in any support whatsoever for the Cuban guerrillas that were trained by Americans. And so it was a complete embarrassment, but Kennedy took absolutely full blame for everything. He didn't try to make up excuses or anything else. But then, of course, the defining moment of his presidency was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's why I said, thank God that Nixon wasn't president at the time. Kennedy had almost no support aside from the Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, and of course the Attorney General, his brother Robert Kennedy. Everybody was pressuring Kennedy to strike first, which most likely would have started World War III, which would have been the final war because it would have been a nuclear war. But Kennedy handled those 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis better than anybody I could have think in history could have handled it. And that was definitely the defining moment of his presidency, as well as starting the movement for the Civil Rights Act, along with Dr. King, which was then fulfilled the following year under Johnson's administration. But I think the biggest thing that Kennedy gave this country was hope. Was the hope that we could do great things. And I think he's the last president who did that. It was the intangibles that Kennedy had. The youth, the hope, the vibrance. His speeches were absolutely amazing. Probably, aside maybe from Lincoln, I would say the greatest speech giver and orator of all the presidents was John Kennedy. I mean, just listen to his inaugural address. Beyond the, ask not what your country can do for you, ask for what you could do for your country. The rest of the speech, his inauguration address, is one of the greatest written works of all times. His pledge that by the end of the decade, as he said, with his Boston accent, we will land a man on the moon. His stances on welfare, his stances on national health care, or what we call today universal health care. He was ahead of his time, but he only served 2 years. So it's tough because he easily could have ended up under legend. But I mean, it could be argued putting him in the good category because it was only 2 years, but he did so much in that first 100 days alone that he earns that spot. And it's almost like, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope. He was the last president that really gave this country hope. Obama had some of that, but we'll get to Obama. So anyway, like I said, after Lincoln. So there's you can find it all over the internet. There are all these weird coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy. They were both elected in the 60s. So Lincoln was elected in the election of 1860. Kennedy was elected in the election of 1960. They were both assassinated. Kennedy was assassinated in a Lincoln car. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy, like all these weird coincidences between the two. But for me, the biggest coincidence is their vice presidents, who were both named Johnson, and both Johnsons were pieces of shit at the end of the day. Now, Lyndon Johnson is not Hail Satan category like Andrew Johnson is, but Lyndon Johnson also was probably the most caricature of politician. Number one, apparently Lyndon Johnson had a ginormous Johnson. The nickname for his dick was actually Jumbo. And Johnson loved to intimidate people when he wasn't getting his way by unzipping his fly and just laying out that long-ass dick on a table. He would also get super close to people, like super close, where he would back them into corners. He was a fucking bully, basically. He was a big-ass bully. He was a big man, a big Texan man. Lyndon Johnson, yes, he signs, the Civil Rights Act into law, but again, that was more remnants of the Kennedy administration than anything else. But the big issue with Johnson is Vietnam. Now, what would have happened in Vietnam if Kennedy had lived? That's a whole separate conversation. All we know is what happened with Vietnam when Johnson became president. And he painted himself into such a negative space that he announced on live television that I will not be seeking a second term for office, and I will not accept my party's nomination to be your president of the United States. He just painted himself into an inescapable corner where he just was like, yo, let somebody else deal with this shit, man. I don't want to deal with this. So with Johnson, it's tough. He wasn't a bad president by any means, but he made very poor decisions. He could have been a great president. He wasn't a bad president. He was a good president. He was a good president. There were some good things that he did do, but between his bullying, again, kind of the way he takes over after Kennedy dies. He did continue, again, a lot of the momentum that Kennedy had started, the most notable being the Civil Rights Act. He also nominated the first Black Supreme Court justice, which was Thurgood Marshall. But yeah, escalating, jumbo escalating that Vietnam War, man. That's the big negative on his presidency, and then basically just quitting on his stool, so to speak, by saying, look, I don't even want this job no more. Have somebody else handle it. And that opens the door for tricky Dick Nixon to sneak back in. So following Johnson refusing the nomination by his party to run for a second term, Nixon actually wins in a landslide. And Nixon is tough. Nixon is tough because, yes, he's remembered for the Watergate scandal. He's remembered for really prolonging the Vietnam War when it could have been ended much earlier, because basically the terms of ending the war were the same terms that were available a couple of years earlier, which was another big, issue with Nixon. But Nixon is the president who solidifies not just the distrust of politicians, not just the distrust of presidents, but the distrust of politicians in general with the Watergate scandal and the cover-up. And once all the tapes leak out and people start hearing the real truth of what happens in the Oval Office. Now, Nixon was not the first president by far to record conversations in the White House. That actually started with Eisenhower. Eisenhower brought it over to the White House from the Nazis. He saw the Nazis had hidden tape recorders in all the major offices of the high-ranking officials. Kennedy taped conversations, Johnson taped conversations. Just Nixon was the one that got caught, and caught during a scandal. But Nixon also was the first president to open up talks with China. He was an amazing politician. He was a brilliant politician, actually. He's most remembered for his crimes, But prior to the whole Watergate scandal, his presidency was really good. I mean, he did, end up bringing the Vietnam War to its end. He established the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. He presided over the moon landing, fulfilling Kennedy's promise. And he wins a second term in a huge landslide victory. He opens up talk and trade with communist China. So as much as most people would expect me to maybe even put him in the Hail Satan category or the bad category, I got to put Nixon in the good category. Overall, yes, he did terrible things to the presidency, but he also did a lot of good that still, resonates today. Then, of course, Richard Nixon's vice president at the time, Spiro Agnew, himself resigned over some scandals. So Gerald Ford was appointed vice president. And then, of course, in 1974, Richard Nixon resigns from office. Ford pardons him, and Ford becomes the only president who was never elected to federal office, meaning he never ran for vice president, nor did he run for president. And again, with Gerald Ford, it's tough because he only serves out the rest of Nixon's term. He's remembered mainly being the only president never to be voted into office. And he inherited an absolute hot mess of a mess, of course. And speaking of hot messes, I'm going to take a quick break. I got to go and take a quick leak. I'll be right back. And back to the show, ladies and gentlemen. So Gerald Ford. Fun. That was the interesting fact about Ford. They can drop during trivia or whatever it is. He's the only president not to be elected to federal office. So with Ford, he's also famous for being the president who had just a bunch of like gaffes. Like falling down the stairs after getting off of Air Force One, having two women try to assassinate him within a 2-week period. 2 assassination attempts by 2 different females. So he's the only president to be targeted twice, and the only president to be targeted by female assassins. The first one was Squeaky Fromme. Squeaky Fromme was a member of the Manson family, and she didn't get a shot off. I think the gun wasn't loaded or misfired or something. But the second woman who attempted to shoot Ford did get shots off, but she missed Ford. What did Ford do in his 2 years in office? Not much. He just inherited a big mess. He did somewhat help soothe the anger in the country over Watergate, Vietnam, just a whole mess between Johnson and Nixon. he really, I mean, the nail in his coffin was pardoning Nixon. That was the big nail in his coffin and why he didn't get a second term. Ford is also, as I said, he was a male model in his younger days. Ford was a pretty good looking dude. But where do I put Ford on the list? It's tough to say because he wasn't a good president. He wasn't a bad president. I think he has to fall into the not applicable category because he just didn't do anything. He didn't get anything done. He was just kind of thrown into the deep end, and, you know, he just did his best to swim for dear life. So after Ford, we get Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter was the first, was the president when I was born. I forget what I'm like trying to word it properly, but he was my first president, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So I was born during the Carter administration. Jimmy Carter, known for being a peanut farmer, of course, prior to being president. He's still alive, still kicking. Probably the best one-term president we've ever had. He's done more post-presidency than he did during his presidency, and he's done more post-presidency, I think, than any other president in the history. He's the man who founded Habitat for Humanity, for which he won a Nobel Peace Prize. He devotes himself to all types of humanitarian causes. To this day, still helping build houses for people, writing children's books. He inherited, again, the impossible. He inherited just bad after bad after bad. Terrible economy, mainly spurred on by Nixon's policies, and Ford really not doing anything in his 2 years to fix those policies, which then led to an economic downturn. Then there was the oil and gasoline issue. So he had a rough time of it. And then, of course, there was the hostage situation, for which Reagan then gets all the credit for, even though it was Carter who was the one who facilitated the freeing of all the hostages. But then again, Carter's policy towards Iran also kind of led to the hostage crisis. So it's tough. I think history has definitely vindicated Carter. Yeah, he was a good president. I think he deserved a second term. Now we have, for me at least, in my generation, because I grew up, I mean, I was born during Carter's administration, but I grew up in the Reagan administration, which is just so decisive as far as presidents go. Possibly the most decisive president, more so than even Trump, in my opinion. Reagan, I can't think of a single good thing Reagan did, to be honest with you. Ronald Reagan presided over an era of scandals, over an era of ignorance. Now, I completely understand. If you were in the top 10% of the wealthy in this country, then of course Reagan was the best. Reagan was the perfect president for the 80s, the era of decadence, the era of cocaine, the era of just extra. But Ronald Reagan, the Iran-Contra scandal, his handling of the AIDS situation, which turned into the AIDS pandemic, his absolute hatred for the poor, the crack epidemic, The list just goes on. And as I've said previously, Rocky IV did more to end the Soviet Union than Ronald Reagan ever did. Ronald Reagan gets all this credit, but that's what I think of Reagan. Hail Satan. I think Reagan was one of the worst, and I know it's a controversial, and it's a divisive stance, and it's a hot take. But growing up in the 80s, you felt Reagan and Reagan's policies. Trickle-down economics absolutely doesn't work. I mean, yeah, you could try to explain it and tell people, hey, this is how it works. It makes perfect sense. Yeah, on paper it does, but in reality it doesn't. Much like, a communist utopia. Yeah, on paper it all sounds good, socialism, but it just doesn't work. So Reagan, definitely, and just not coming out, and again, because originally AIDS was not called AIDS. AIDS was called GRID, G-R-I-D, gay-related immune deficiency syndrome. And Reagan just completely ignored it. Reagan didn't even say the word AIDS until like 1985. It wasn't really until Rock Hudson died, because Rock Hudson was the first big celebrity death attributed to AIDS, and at that point, Reagan couldn't ignore it anymore. But yeah, I mean, Reagan is... I understand why the older generation praises him, but I think if Reagan... I was actually talking to Ken on Discord about this yesterday, because we were talking about how in a one-year span between 80 and 81, John Lennon was shot and killed, Reagan was shot but lived, the Pope was shot, Sadat was shot, but they all lived. And not to wish death on anyone, of course, but if Reagan had died and George H.W. Bush became president, I think this country would have been much better off. George H.W. Bush gets a lot of negative press, mainly because of the last several months of his presidency. The first 3 years of his presidency were amazing. He did an incredible job. And they buried him. They buried him because he caved towards the end of his third year, going into the end of his term, when he raised taxes. Because it was on TV 24/7. Read my lips, no new taxes. And the Clinton administration destroyed him with that. But overall, I think much like Carter, George Bush the First gets a very bad rap. And I actually think he was a great president. He was an absolutely great president. But we're getting into the 90s now, and we're getting into the sound bites, the keep it, what was it? The KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, which was Clinton's camp's motto, keep it simple, stupid. I think George H.W. Bush was a great president who definitely deserved a second term. Definitely deserved a second term. Now we're getting down to the final four. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton. Oh, Bill Clinton. So while poor George H.W. Bush was getting lampooned for throwing up in the Japanese prime minister's lap and that no new taxes thing, Bill Clinton was pimping it up on the Arsenio Hall show, playing the saxophone, talking about smoking weed, but I never inhaled. I just took the puff. I didn't inhale, though. Bullshit. You inhaled, son. But then, of course, all them sex scandals. It's almost like putting a tuxedo on trailer park trash. That would have been Bill Clinton. But really, I mean, I always saw Clinton's term in office as kind of like a jump off point, even though the presidency is supposed to be like the highest level you can achieve in the world. Like it's like it's the last job you'll ever have, right? Because where do you go from being president unless, you're Taft and you go on to become Supreme Court Justice. But I always saw Clinton, and especially Hillary Clinton, like using the presidency as almost like a jumping off point for things they wanted to do in the future. Did he do some good things? Sure. He did some good things, I guess. But it was just all the scandals. And again, I mean, you can make excuses for Clinton and say, well, what's the big deal? So he got some head, and all that. But again, you're the president of the United States, man. Act accordingly. Respect the office, right? Don't blame the victim. Okay? Bill Clinton was a predator. I mean, there's no other way about it. I think he was a bad president. Even though I like Bill Clinton as a person, even though he's a piece of shit, but I like Bill Clinton. He's charismatic. But Clinton was, not a good president. I know a lot of people are surprised when I say that. They expect me to be like a big fan of Clinton, but absolutely not. George W. Bush. Now, George W. Bush got a lot of flack for basically people just thought he was just a dummy, an idiot. Far from it. George W. Bush is actually a very, very intelligent person. Is he a good public speaker? Absolutely not. Does he make mistakes and gaffes? Absolutely. But to call him an idiot is unfair. Did he make a lot of poor choices? Absolutely he did. But even though I still think he was a bad president, I also never agreed, because no matter, like I said, like the office, like the president, don't like the president, you always respect the office, right? There's always going to be the party of opposition, which is the party that lost. But I never liked when people would just make fun of George Bush for being stupid. Did he make stupid decisions? Absolutely. Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama falls into the Kennedy category. Not saying he's a great president. He doesn't belong in here. I'm saying a president that could have done great things. Whenever somebody asks me about my opinion on Barack Obama, I always say I wish he waited 10 more years. I really wish he waited 10 more years to run, because he only had 2 years in the Senate and that was it. He didn't understand how things worked, right? You got to know how to work the system, no matter where you go. Do you think it's any different anywhere else? In any company? In the public school system? You don't think you got to work the system? In college, it's even worse. He didn't know how to work the system. He thought he was just going to get by on his intellect, which is, he's definitely one of the smartest presidents we ever had. No doubt. But while he did some good things, one of the few presidents where really there were pretty much no scandals, aside from the time he wore that tan suit. And I was like, motherfucker, did he just wear a tan suit? What does he think this is, Harlem? But I wish Barack Obama waited 10 more years before he ran. I think he could have been right next to Kennedy in the great category. But he wasn't a bad president by far. But he was a good president who could have been great. And that leaves us with Donald Trump. I mean, do I really have to say anything? I mean, look, here's my take on Donald Trump. Never should have been president. But I understand why he was elected. Okay? I understand why he was elected. Because people wanted to basically throw a Molotov cocktail at all of politics. And who better to choose than Donald Trump? My problem is that after a while, people still stuck and wouldn't admit that they made a mistake. Okay? Like, I remember about 6 months into his presidency, I was having a meeting with some other historians. History teachers. And we were all talking about it. And I said, look, man, my biggest, because there were a couple who were pro-Trump. And I said, look, this is my biggest issue. I understand why you elected him. And I'm not saying you were wrong to elect Trump. Hillary was not a good choice whatsoever. If anybody else, if it was Bernie Sanders, Bernie would have won. If it was, even if it was Elizabeth Warren would have beat Trump. But there was no way Hillary was beating Trump. The problem is that you were tired of all of the lifelong politicians. You wanted someone in there who was like you. The average, well, not the average Joe, because we're not all millionaires, but you get what I'm saying, like somebody who's not a politician. And to be like, hey, you know what? He's going to fix things. He's going to tell them how it is. Just like us, man, from the streets. He's going to walk into that Oval Office and be like, yo, bitches, there's a new sheriff in town. And the problem was that people stuck with the lie they told themselves, that it was a good idea. That was my problem. I said, it's okay at this point to say, look, we thought it was a good idea at the time, but we fucked up. Right? But no, people still wanted to stick by, even though what the hell did he do for 4 years except for embarrass this country, embarrass the office of the presidency, bungle every single thing he had, which led to a global pandemic. Because he said, oh, it's not even going to be a big deal, this coronavirus thing. What are you talking about? I predict we're going to have like 20 deaths. And then it becomes, it's not going to be more than like 500. Maybe 10,000. Maybe 50,000. You know, it's like SpongeBob, 1 year later, 1 million dead. Just absolutely not someone who should have ever been elected president. And I still don't get people who support him. Yeah, so that's my take on it, and that's all I got to say about that. So again, I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I love doing these tier lists. I appreciate everyone who stuck with me for these 2 hours and 20 some odd minutes. And again, thank you guys for all your support. Thank you for hanging out with me tonight. Thank you for making me feel a little better. Been a little down this week. But I really appreciate it, fam. So I will see y'all in the next videos. Have a good night, everybody, and I'll catch you later. Fam! And shouting out the Patreons who keep things running, starting with the Chancellors. Chris H., Blue Tech, Phoenix, Laughing Jackal, Electra James, Elena G., and Douglas C., The Principals, James R., Spacey Doodle, Ulrike, Mick, Quiet J, Clement, Vajandra, Murika Kari, Alan, Chad, Alex, Lauren, Aaron Shepard, Chris L., Lord Gandalf, Freeman, Nathan, Rasmus, Harry, The Boggle, Sophia, Robin, Luna, and Grumpy Scott. I've been Teacher Eddie, and I'll see you next time.